How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 74th video on the channel, and today we're going to be going through more of a resume of a theory of language by Hjelmslev. In our previous video on this book, we looked at how functives, Hjelmslev's word for the entities that make up functions in linguistics, can be separated into those that are variant and those that are invariant. We also introduced the idea of rearticulation or analysis, quickly going over the differences between field and participant functives, along with their respective functions of exclusion and participation. In today's video, we'll be continuing this line of exploration and go over what exactly rearticulation means in more depth. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. Here, you can see how participations become configurations within Hjelmslev's glossomatic algebra. As a quick recap, the former refers to functions that include variants or common elements, contrasting exclusions that, as the name suggests, don't overlap. Configurations are made up of participants that function to fields, the functives of exclusion. On the left, you can see a set of participants in the form of boxes marked by Greek letters next to vertical ellipses. For the sake of explanation, let's just say that lowercase beta refers to the word small, uppercase beta refers to big, and uppercase gamma to size. We can then break these participants into fields, marked by A, B, and C, each carrying the same value as the Greek letter, and C being the center, to be seen as a neutral term. Focusing in on the example of small, or the participant of lowercase beta, we can see that two kinds of relationships exist between it and its fields. On the one hand, you have occupation. On the other, there's insistence. Starting with the former, the single diagonal lines in the fields B and C indicate that a variation of a participant can cover them. For example, small occupies the field big, marked here with B, when someone asks, how big is it? Likewise, it occupies the field size, marked C, when discussing, the size of something small. This contrasts insistence, symbolized with a full cross. A good way to think about beta insisting on A is that the participant emphasizes it. They both refer to small after all. The formal definition Hjelmslev gives is that a participant insists upon fields that it contains in all first-degree variations, although the specifics aren't too important for now. What we do need to address is how we talk about language when dealing with glossomatics. So far, we've been talking in terms of substance. Big and small are actual words. However, for what Hjelmslev is doing, the focus is solely on the idea of form, the functions that those words manifest. In this way, it's actually inappropriate to translate participants like beta into substantial things. Nevertheless, I will still try my best to do so when I can, as although not quite rigorously glossomatic, I feel that not offering examples will do more harm than good. Just keep this disclaimer in mind. Returning back to the text, here are the 7 possible participants that we can have when dealing with 3 field exclusions. If you remember from last time, we used the example of a configuration for width that contained narrow and wide. We saw that the former occupies only its own field in a 2-field exclusion, whilst the latter occupies both. There we could classify them as lowercase alpha and uppercase alpha respectively. With this diagram, the same general idea applies, although it's a little more complicated on account of a greater number of fields. The odd one out amongst these participants is uppercase gamma 2. As you might have noticed, the diagonal line in its field for B is backwards, symbolizing that it either occupies that and C, or C and A. In certain cases, the picture in that diagram gets a bit more complicated. Specifically, this is where Hjelmslev introduces the concepts of multiplication, dimension, and partement. The first is simple enough. Basically, it's sometimes possible or necessary for the functival class in question to go beyond one set of boxes cut up into exclusions. In these situations, the table can be written without fields, having participants along both the vertical axis and the horizontal axis. The word dimension describes the classes that are attached to these axes, whilst a partment is a functive that belongs to them. To take a step back, in our last episode, we distinguished between relations and correlations, talking about how the former focus on processes and the latter focus on systems. We also introduced the terms solidarity and combination, where the first describes relations between functives that require each other, and the second describes the opposite, that is, relations where they are simply compatible. However, in today's episode, our focus is almost purely correlational. This is why Hjelmslev offers the functions of complementarity, marked with an upside-down cross, and autonomy, symbolized by a regular cross, corresponding to solidarity and combination, respectively. This is useful to us because it makes it possible to examine the functions between partments, our dimensional participants themselves. Beginning inside the brackets, lowercase and uppercase alpha are complementary. They need each other. This is the same for the beta partments, whilst the regular ones for gamma are autonomous. However, this isn't all. Whilst the alpha partment are just compatible or autonomous in relation to the two kinds of beta, the same can't be said when it comes to comparing those to gamma. If you have a beta, you need a gamma, and vice versa. Outside of all this, gamma 2 is the exception. It can appear no matter what the status of the other partments is. It's on this note that we get to maybe the part of Hjelmslev's résumé that can seem the most confusing: the diagrams he gives of multi-dimensional configurations. Before we get there though, a few other definitions become important. Namely, our author introduces the concept of a sum, basically a class that is function to other classes. For example, a dimension is a sum. It's a collection of partments that contract a function with a similar collection. At this point, all you need to know about sums is that they can be simplex or complex. Simplex sums contain only one thing, whilst complex ones are larger and can be given more specific names depending on how many members they have. Concerning the configurations we're dealing with here, there's only one simplex possible, uppercase gamma 2. This is due to the fact that it's the only one that doesn't contract a complementary function. With complex sums, on the other hand, it's a completely different situation. Alongside the simplex, this diagram includes a duplex based on alpha partments, a triplex based on the correlation that the two betas contract with lowercase gamma, and a quadruplex following the pattern of a duplex. It's important to keep in mind that there are many alternative configurations for these sums, such as a quadruplex made up of the two betas and the gammas. Where things get truly complicated is when we start dealing with configurations composed of more than two dimensions. This specific sum is called an octuplex and has three dimensions: one vertical, one horizontal, and one slanting. In his paper Outline of a Danish Expression System, Hjelmslev uses such an octuplex to explain the vowel system of a language, hence the IPA symbols in the boxes instead of irregular crosses. With this, the lowercase alpha partment of a vertical dimension corresponds to unrounded vowels, whilst the uppercase alpha partment is rounded ones. In the same order, the horizontal dimension is constructed on the front-back opposition. Finally, the slanting one is used to distinguish between lowercase alpha closed vowels and uppercase alpha open ones. Taken all together, we get an important part of the Danish expression system. Moving away from configurations for a while, it's time to talk about what exactly a category is, and how it relates to the concept of establishment. Simply put, a category is a paradigm, meaning a class of elements that makes up part of a system that contracts correlation with other paradigms of the same level or rank. With this in mind, establishment refers to the relation contracted between sums and functions, the latter acting as constants. It connects to categories through the additional concepts of polarity and homology, which correspond respectively to correlations that do and don't act to establish such a category. In this diagram, you can see the 12 possible polarities on the top and the 9 possible homologies on the bottom. You may have already noticed, but each polarity is contracted between a lowercase and uppercase Greek letter, whilst each homology is made up of those of the same kind. We call the functives involved in these two operations polars and homologs respectively, although their specific definitions require the introduction of some other concepts first. For now, just keep in mind the lowercase-uppercase distinction that defines polarities. At this point, our focus will be on what happens to functives that appear in certain conditions and not in others. Picture the constructions of the article a and a noun. When a as a functive is present, like in the phrase a hyena, we say that it applies. However, sometimes you get statements like an organ, where we say that our expression-based functive of a is suspended. These phenomena are used to create the basis for Hjelmslev's definition of overlappings and syncretisms, which will later help us describe how the results of free articulation work. Beginning with the function of overlapping, symbolized in glossomatic notation with a slash, it fundamentally deals with suspended mutations. If you don't remember from our first video in this series, or haven't watched it yet, a mutation is simply a relation between members of the same class. In this particular case, borrowed from Analysis in Outline of Man by Unekanga, exchanging the letters P and B in a word causes a mutation that affects both the content and expression of a sign. Pan and ban are different words after all. However, this function, properly called commutation, is suspended when, for example, the functives involved occur after the letter S. Whilst the expression of span differs from that of span, they both have the same content. As a result, in such a situation, we can say P and B contract a overlapping, with the category that they make up being called a syncretism. With this in mind, subjunctions are kind of like the correlation equivalent to this whole thing. As another recap, relations concern the and/or function, specifically how different functives form chains with each other. They contrast correlations insofar as these act according to the either-or function, where the replacement of elements in a system is what matters. Accordingly, a subjunction is made up of the categories of suspended and applied correlates. However, it itself doesn't establish a category, because the involved functives are connected by combination. They can be together, but they don't have to be. Following our earlier definition of establishment, as requiring its function to work as a constant, a subjunction just doesn't fit the definition. Nevertheless, this doesn't mean that the concept isn't important. Alongside an overlapping, a subjunction can form what is known as a dominance with the variant, something marked with the E-looking element symbol here. Such a dominance is defined as a solidarity, and hence involves functives that require each other. Using examples from both the expression and content planes this time, the top illustrates our earlier example of the overlapping of P and B before S, whilst the bottom has to do with the second person pronoun, you. In terms of its content, you can think about there being a suspended function between the plural and the singular. The same form means both things. This is called the dominate. The variant that acts as a dominant in connection to this is simply the description of second person, since as a variant it covers both members of a suspended function. If you want to be more specific, a dominance with a subjunction can be called a defectivation, whilst one with an overlapping is a syncretization. However, these terms aren't particularly important, and we will generally use dominance as a catch-all term. It's here that we get back to polars and homologs, where we can use what we just introduced to develop a more exhaustive description. To begin with, correlates that form syncretisms within the category that is undergoing free articulation are also polar, whilst those that only enter into subjunctions are homologs. Using this, polars marked with a lowercase Greek letter are described as intensive, whilst their uppercase equivalents are extensive. If you remember from last time, we looked at this configuration that was contracted between fields and participants linked to narrow and wide respectively. We said that the narrow participant was intensive, whilst the wide one was extensive, marking them both with the letter alpha. The reason why came down literally to their extension. Wide covered more fields than narrow. Although not obviously a part of Hjelmslev's definition, this is one way the distinction surfaces in practice. However, to be more accurate, we also have to add some nuance to the intensive-extensive pair. Essentially, the polars marked with a lowercase Greek letter have dominant variants, whilst uppercase ones don't. Yet again, it's here that Hjelmslev adds another set of definitions to complicate his system even more, although this is the second to last group we'll have to be looking at today. The definitions in question are of contensives and the prefixes ex, in, and pseudo. You can see the contensives at the top, split depending on the case of a letter. These are polars, but can't be given a designation as intensive or extensive due to not contracting a polarity that would make that possible. Nevertheless, they can still play those roles in other correlations, hence the idea of lowercase pseudo-intensives and uppercase pseudo-extensives. These are a bit similar to the idea of extensives and inextensives, which refer to intensives that act like extensives in a correlation, and vice versa respectively. Again, although this barrage of definitions might seem a bit overwhelming, I'll try to explain important ones when they come up again. However, for now, we have all we need to outline what exactly is registered through free articulation, done through a series of steps called tempi. The first tempo focuses on working out what pairs of correlates are made up of polars. The easiest way to do this is to see whether or not one member is extensive and another is intensive by looking at their relationship with dominances. It's simple when one has a dominant and the other doesn't. Nevertheless, sometimes you get situations where both or neither members of a pair have dominant varieties. The first thing to do here is see if a member acts as an intensive somewhere else, demonstrated at the top left of this diagram. In the case that it does, then the other member is registered to be extensive. The same thing also applies the other way around, hence the top right. However, sometimes it's necessary to register them as contensive if neither of these tests work out. This is what is shown at the bottom. After completing the tempo, the second concerns what to do with correlates that can't easily be identified as polars or homologs. Because of a sort of glossomatic limbo that they occupy, it gets a bit strange here. Like last time, the trick is working out whether or not they have any dominant variants. If the answer is yes, they are registered as intensive. If not, they are contensive. There's no way to work out for certain if any of them are extensive. This leads straight into the third tempo, which simply states that as many intensives and extensives as possible should be converted into the glossomatic notation that renders participants as Greek letters. Nearing the end of a section of a procedure, Hjelmslev offers a rule. Namely, he states that all the fields that are involved in a participation, usually symbolized with a Latin letter next to vertical ellipses, can be thought of as variations of that very participation. For example, going back to the diagram with the box for the participant small, again translated as lowercase beta, the fields marked by A, C, and B, small size and big respectively, can be registered as its variations. According to Hjelmslev, it is possible to undertake a complete calculation of all such variations in the functional class undergoing the procedure. It's with this that I would like to conclude. Having now finished Hjelmslev's explanation of a procedure necessary to undertake free articulation, I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong, wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments, so I can do better. Next time, we'll likely be finishing Character Analysis by Wilhelm Reich, or continuing on with the seminars of Felix Guattari. Until then, bye!